to the Sentience Institute podcast and to our 22nd episode. I'm Michael Delajakovo, Strategy Lead and Researcher at Sentience Institute. On the Sentience Institute podcast, we interview activists, entrepreneurs, and researchers about the most effective strategies to expand humanity's moral circle. Our guest for today is Raphaël Millière. Raphaël is the 2020 Robert A. Burt Presidential Scholar in Society and Neuroscience in the Center for Science and Society, and a lecturer in the philosophy department at Columbia University. He completed his PhD in philosophy at the University of Oxford, where he focused on self-consciousness. His interests lie primarily in the philosophy of artificial intelligence and cognitive science. He is particularly interested in assessing the capacities and limitations of deep artificial neural networks and establishing fair and meaningful comparisons with human cognition in various domains, including language understanding, reasoning, and planning. And I'm excited to get stuck into large language models with Raphaël today. All right, so I'm joined now by Raphaël Millière. Raphaël, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm looking forward to getting stuck into large language models with you today. But to start, I just want to ask what your background is and how you came to work on AI.
Yes, so I have a background in philosophy. I'm a philosopher by training. I did my PhD in philosophy at the University of Oxford. But I've long had an interest in cognitive science generally, including artificial intelligence. And so perhaps somewhat unusually for a philosopher, I've been involved in a lot of interdisciplinary research, working with researchers across different disciplines. So psychology, neuroscience, and more recently, computer science. So I've had a long-standing interest in AI, generally speaking. But for a while, there was more of a side interest of mine. So during my PhD, I was working more specifically within the philosophy of cognitive science on self-representation and self-consciousness. And I had this side project for which I started using natural language processing algorithms. And my interest in these algorithms for that particular project was instrumental, as it were. So I wasn't directly interested in investigating the capacities, limitations of the kind of model. But as I was doing this, and I in the process, learned how to train a model from scratch and fine-tune models and do this kind of thing, I got really interested in this. And it was before language models came around. It was started around 2015. So I was using earlier word embedding models, but I really thought there is something there really interesting philosophically, some substantive foundational questions that haven't really been discussed yet. There is a long literature in philosophy on artificial intelligence generally, and there are some really interesting older discussions about connectionist models, neural networks from the 90s, for example. But really, this whole literature hadn't really been updated in light of new developments with deep learning and with new techniques in NLP. So I got really interested in that. And already then I was thinking, once I'm done with the PhD, I might want to focus more specifically on this. And then in 2017, the Transformer paper came out, Attention is All You Need, which described the main architecture that is still used today to create these large language models and chatbots. And that really changed the game in NLP. And then language models started coming out, initially GPT-1, GPT-2. And just as I was done with my PhD and about to start my current position at Columbia University, in the summer of 2020, GPT-3 came out, which was a real turning point because it really demonstrated how powerful this technology could be and what language models could do. Before that, it was more akin to proofs of concept or time models. They were interesting. They could generate some grammatical text, but they couldn't do really impressive things. And then GPT-3 came out, and it was a real change. And so that's when I thought, okay, I really want to be working on this technology as my main focus in my philosophical research, and also further develop collaborations across disciplinary boundaries with people in computer science. And I really want to work on assessing the capacities and limitations of these models in light of various questions from the philosophy of cognitive science. Because a lot of people in the field of the philosophy of AI work on ethical issues that are very important and interesting. But I think there is also room to work on the more foundational, substantive, not to say that the ethical questions are not substantive, that's not what I meant, but more that the foundational questions that are more connected to certain long-standing issues in the philosophy of cognitive science, and I think that can inform the ethical questions as well downstream. So, for example, do language models really understand language? In what sense can we say that they do or don't? What kinds of other cognitive capacities, if any, can we ascribe to them? All of these questions are supposed to inform also the practical ethical questions that people generally focus on in the philosophy of AI. So I think there is really, I thought at the time there was really a need to focus on these questions.
Great, thank you for that. I'm glad you mentioned ChatGPT and GPT-3. It does seem like there's been an explosion of interest since around mid to late 2022, which coincides with the release of ChatGPT, maybe a little bit earlier than that. And I guess that's, you could argue the interest has exploded because the capabilities have exploded. And it really seems like there has been a large increase in capability and capacity in the last few years. So what has happened in the last few years that we didn't see earlier? I guess we could start off with, I suppose, a discussion of what LLMs are doing and how they actually work. But I'd be interested to understand, I guess, what's changed in the last few years in terms of architecture. I just to prompt you, I know transformer architecture, some have argued has been a major change from around 2017. So could you maybe give us a brief discussion of how large language models work, if there's such a thing, and what's changed in the last few years to increase these capabilities?
Yes. So in some sense, the question, how do language models work and what are they really doing, is the $1 million question that we could spend hours discussing. But I'll give you the kind of first pass version of an answer. So just a brief historical overview. Since the very beginning of empirical work with computers, in the very first computers were invented, say in the 1940s, people have been interested in using this new technology to try to process language in some ways and do things, automate some tasks with language. For example, one of the early research projects with the first computers pertained to machine translation, trying to build systems that could translate from one language to another. And there was a big part of research in AI in the post-Second World War period, with obviously tremendous potential applications in various industries. And so early on, there was this kind of divide between two different approaches to this field of natural language processing with computers. One of them was a more symbolic approach that was heavily inspired by theoretical linguistics and the works of people like Noam Chomsky, and the idea that we could design systems that would draw inspiration from knowledge in theoretical linguistics about grammar, for example, to hand build some rules for these systems to process language programmatically. So, for example, people at the time would design these syntactic parsers that would just embed some grammatical rules provided by linguists to try to break down, to process sentences, break them down, and try to interpret their meaning using these handcrafted ad hoc rules inspired from linguistics. The other paradigm that was developed in parallel, you could call it the stochastic or statistical approach, was trying to do things in a different way. Instead of using this kind of top-down, hand-built set of rules, trying to work from the bottom up with a large amount of data, with a corpus of text, and try to learn from the statistical properties of this corpus without these hand-built rules. And so initially that work was done more in the field of speech recognition. But then, and I'll spare you the details of all this history. It's a very interesting history, but eventually there was this idea that emerged as a very powerful intuition that people call the distributional hypothesis. Is the idea that the meaning of a word is determined by the context in which the word appears. So it's an idea that was initially developed by structural linguists in the 50s. One of the big slogans from summarizing this kind of approach is "You shall know a word by the company it keeps." And this idea kind of percolated into the statistical approach to NLP, with the idea that we can just train or learn, have a model that learns from a large corpus, from the statistical distribution of words in that corpus, to kind of induce or learn some information about the meaning of words and the syntactical roles of words. And that's essentially the intuition that led, with a lot of intermediate steps, to current language models. So the way in which we get to current language models is that people started to try to operationalize that kind of intuition around a set of models that would try to use statistical properties of words, co-occurrence statistics. So, for example, the fact that the word apple and pear both occur very frequently next to the word juice, that tells you that that must be something in common in the meaning of apple and pear. In fact, they are both fruits, and they are both fruits that can be juiced and can be used to flavor juices. It's just one example of how the patterns of distribution of words and the company that words keep can give you a lot of information about what the words mean. And so people realized that you could use that approach, looking at the statistical properties of words, to try to represent the meaning of words as vectors in a high-dimensional vector space. So we don't need to get too deep into the weeds here, but that's a very powerful idea, because it means that then you can represent words as these vectors, where each dimension of the multidimensional vector space in which these vectors are placed captures some aspect of the meaning and potentially syntactic roles of words. And then you can look at the distance between two word vectors, the vectors that stand for two different words, to give you some insight into the semantic distance between two words. So two vectors that are close together in the space, like the vector for apple and the vector for pear, would be for two words that are very close together in terms of their meaning, and vectors that are far away would be vectors that are vectors for words that are very different. So people started working on these word embedding models. A big one was Word2Vec in 2013 that really showed the power of this kind of approach. After decades of it being more of a kind of proof of concept with toy models, it started to show real promise around that time. And then finally we get to the modern language models, basically with this turning point in 2017 that I mentioned already, with this paper, Attention is All You Need, by Vaswani and colleagues, that extended the kind of approach to the modeling of sequences, not just words. So obviously language is more than just a collection of words. When you take a sentence, the order in which the words appear is important. Sentences are not just bags of words, to use a term that's used in NLP. And so if you want to model the whole sequence, you have to also model the relationships between the words in that sequence, including the grammatical structure of the sentence. And this paper from 2017 introduced this transformer architecture that turns out to be a really powerful neural network architecture. So it's an architecture for an artificial neural network that can learn from data. And it has this mechanism called attention that basically enables the model to attend to different kinds of relationships between words, or to model different kinds of relationships between words, including syntactic or grammatical relationships between words, such as subject-verb agreement, for example, and many others. So really what it does is that it enables these models to, as it were, learn the rules of grammar and learns all sorts of other kinds of relationships between words in sequences, in sentences, such that these models, with at least one version of this family of transformer models, is enabled to generate text, to produce text. And so that gave rise to this family of GPT models. GPT just stands for generative pre-trained transformer. So you have this transformer architecture there in the name. It is generative because it can generate text. So you feed it some text and then it can continue that text, generate new text, or just answer questions. And it is pre-trained because you pre-train it on a massive amount of data, a subset of the whole internet, a really large corpus with all of Wikipedia, hundreds of thousands of books, and millions of web pages. And once it's been pre-trained in this way, it can perform a bunch of different tasks just by having the user ask in the input, in the prompt to the model, ask the model to do something, a certain tasks. It could be summarize this paragraph or answer that question or write a story about something, write a news story about something. And these models turned out to be really good at doing that, even though they hadn't really been pre-trained specifically for these tasks. So the pre-training objective, what we call the learning objective in machine learning for these models, again, by being trained on this whole very large corpus scraped from the internet, is very simple. It's just next word prediction. So the models will sample sequences of text from this corpus and try to predict which word follows from that sequence. And it does that over and over again, millions of times. At the beginning, it's no better than chance. It's really bad at it. It will just predict random words. And as it goes, it gets better and better because every time it makes this prediction of the word that follows a sequence that's randomly sampled from this very large corpus, there is a method, a procedure to calculate how wrong it was, so how far off it was with its prediction, and then use that measured error to update the weights of the model. So it's like adjusting the knobs inside the model to make it a little bit better. So every time it predicts a word, it doesn't get it very right. You can adjust the knobs slightly, course correct, get the model to be a little bit better, and then do this millions of times. And eventually you get your pre-trained model that is really, really good at next word prediction. And the thing that no one really saw coming, I think, and 10 years ago, people would have thought to be crazy, is that just by doing this, just by playing this next word prediction game, you can end up with a model, if it's big enough and trained on enough data, like GPT-3, GPT-4, that can do a really remarkable range of things that maybe you wouldn't have thought abstractly without having seen this result that you could do just by playing this next word prediction game. So sometimes people will say things like these models are just fancy autocomplete, they just do next word prediction, as if that's kind of a limitation on the range of things they can do once they've been pre-trained. But it's important to keep in mind that in the process of doing next word prediction so well on so many different linguistic contexts, so again, if you think the model is sampling sequences from the training data, it will sample some sequences from books, some sequences from Wikipedia articles, some sequences from Reddit threads, discussion threads. It will have to be really good at next word prediction in virtually any kind of context, on any kind of topic. And in order to become so good in all of these different contexts, in fact, these models are superhuman at next word prediction compared to humans. They do much better at predicting the next word. Presumably, that forces the model, in order to become so good, to learn a lot in the process, right? Including learning how to produce grammatical sentences that are not just gibberish, but also learning a lot of world knowledge, learning a lot of knowledge about how things are in the world, such that the sentences are not, nonsensical, even if they are grammatically well formed. That they actually, if you want to predict the next word correctly, you have to know a lot about what is the most plausible next word based on how the world actually works. And all sorts of other kinds of knowledge that people are still kind of trying to probe and find out exactly how much these models know, how much they can do, what kind of capacities we can ascribe to them. But the bottom line is how these models work. Short answer is by being pre-trained with this next word prediction learning objective, just playing this next word prediction game on a large amount of data. And long answer is, in that process, they seem to learn a lot in the process of doing next word prediction very well. And researchers are still trying to find out exactly what kinds of capacities or computations they learn in that process. And people disagree about that.
Great, thank you. I think that was a really good primer to go a little bit deeper. I think you've already touched on this a little bit, but I know that you've said previously there is a tendency for polarization in talking about large language models between two very strong sets of claims, which you've called deflationary and inflationary claims. So I'd just like to give you an opportunity to explain what those claims are and why you think those are problems.
Yes, so that's something that I think is very salient in the current discourse on language models. And you see that if you go in the opinion section of the New York Times and you see essays, op-eds on ChatGPT, essentially, a lot of them will be either saying something like, the headline will be something like, ChatGPT it's not smart at all. It's as dumb as a toaster. It's not what you think it is. It's again just network prediction or fancy autocomplete. It's a cheap trick, and it is it is not it is not is not making any progress towards genuine artificial intelligence. Or you will see people saying that ChatGPT and similar models are harbingers of human-like intelligence, and that they're on the verge of breaking through to artificial general intelligence and maybe even superhuman intelligence, and that just a few years we might be facing existential risk from super intelligent AI that threatens to eradicate the human species. So you get these really radical views that are extremely polarized on both extremes of the spectrum. So either these models are not intelligent at all, they're really dumb, they're doing this really cheap trick of next word prediction, and some people say they're stochastic parrots that just haphazardly stitch together bits and pieces from the training data without producing anything novel or anything that is deserving of the description of any psychological capacity or cognitive capacity. Or they exhibit sparks of artificial general intelligence, and they're almost there, almost at the level, at human level, on various tasks. And I find that a little frustrating as a researcher, because I think there is a huge, rich middle ground between these two extremes that hasn't been as present in the public discourse, at least. I mean, of course, a lot of serious researchers are working on charting that middle ground and taking various positions in between. But if you look again at op-eds, public op-eds, people on Twitter, things like that, including the outputs of some researchers, it tends to be quite polarized. And I think that's a shame, because I personally think the truth is somewhere in between. These models are, as I said, just because they do next word prediction doesn't tell you really that much about what they learn to do in the process of doing next word prediction so well. It seems that they do genuinely acquire some non-trivial capacities in that process, but they're also severely limited in other ways. And certainly I think they're extremely far from something like general human-like intelligence in various respects. But the devil is in the detail. And I think it's... I understand why people tend to gravitate towards these polarized positions, because there's something comforting about being able to argue for a very determinate stance about what these models are and what they can do. Either taking on this very deflationary take and saying, well, they're just fancy to complete, they can't do much, just cheap tricks. So you have this sense that you kind of really know what hides beyond the hype that is pandered by venture capitalists and some companies, and you can say, well, don't be fooled, this is what these models really do. Or on the other hand of the spectrum, people thinking that they've uncovered the true capacities of these models that would be close to human intelligence in various respects. And also there's something comforting about feeling that you are lucid about what these models can do, and you have the answer. And the truth is, I think people are still kind of stumbling in the dark, as it were, in this line of research, trying to find out what these models can and cannot do, how they work, and reverse engineer the computations that they induce during training. And that's a long and painstaking process, as is often the case in science. And I think we should be more kind of practical and persist about this, and to perform experiments and gradually learn more and more about how these models work. But I think no one really has a fully worked out answer just yet. And that's not to say that anything goes, and that perhaps we'll find out these models are basically it's not to kind of endorse a kind of mystical line of a discourse on these models, that is to say that, oh, these are alien intelligences and we don't really understand how they work. They might be really advanced and we just don't know. That's not what I'm saying. They clearly you can probe their behavior and see that they have various limitations. So it's not to say that, it's just to say that to really truly fully understand how they achieve the behaviors that they can achieve, which is quite remarkable, and how similar the mechanisms that they've implemented to achieve that behavior might be to the mechanisms that human brains or animal brains implement in order to achieve some of their intelligent behaviors. That's a bit of an open question. So we should be pragmatic about this.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not too surprising to me that we see such polarization in something like a New York Times op-ed. I guess that applies to many topics. I guess reasonable opinion pieces don't sell too well, and we don't know how many reasonable opinion pieces were submitted to New York Times. They just chose the most polarized. But I guess I'd like to hear a little bit more about what the dangers are of underclaiming and overclaiming. So Samuel Bauman's paper, which I'm sure you're familiar with, dangers of underclaiming, talks about this. But I guess you could argue that Murray Shanahan's paper talking about large language models maybe is more on the dangers of overclaiming side. So what are the risks, I guess, with underclaiming or overclaiming?
Yeah, so given this polarization of the discourse and the fact that on the one hand you have these very deflationary takes, on the other hand these very inflationary takes, if you think that both of these extreme views are mistaken in some ways, that one of them is not giving enough credit to what these language models can do, the other one is inflating what they can do and giving way to hype, I think there are dangers to both excesses, so dangers to underclaiming what these models can do and dangers to overclaiming what they can do. We can start with the risks of overclaiming because I think they're the most salient. Certainly, there has been a lot of breathless hype about these language models lately, especially since the release of ChatGPT. And a lot of that hype is fueled by economic incentives. There's a lot of money to be made. There are now big companies like OpenAI and others that have a lot of skin in the game. And of course, it's partly in their interest to hype up these systems and to kind of dangle in front of people the promise of something like AGI, artificial general intelligence, which is explicitly the goal of OpenAI, for example, to build AGI. We can come back to that. I have some qualms about this very notion of AGI. I think it's not always a very coherent notion, or at least in the way it's used by some of these companies. But leaving that aside, I think there is this dynamic where some of these companies, the venture capitalists that invest in them, have this incentive to hype up these systems, and there's a risk here because essentially you end up having people misrepresenting what these models can really do and convincing people who don't know any better because they don't work in that field and they don't fully understand, as far as anyone can really fully understand, how these models work. They don't even know the very basics. And because it can feel, of course, borderline magical to interact with these systems, they're very impressive. And because we humans have a remarkable tendency for anthropomorphism when interacting with systems that can converse fluently in language, it's very easy for people to just buy wholesale into this idea that these models are harbingers of superhuman or human-like intelligence. There's this old, phenomenon in research in AI that people call the ELIZA effect, dating back to the observation of Joseph Weizenbaum at MIT in the 60s. He built this chatbot called ELIZA that was a very rudimentary chatbot compared to what ChatGPT can do, using a bunch of kind of clever tricks, using handmade rules, so that you could talk to it, write on a keyboard, and it would respond to you in a somewhat mysterious, elusive way. But people back then in the 60s on the MIT campus were really quick to start treating the system and talking to it as if they were talking to another human. So people are really quick to project certain anthropomorphic traits onto the systems, and all the more so for language models. So I think that's the clear risk of overclaiming, is to essentially mislead people with all sorts of potential nefarious downstream consequences, but having people ascribing too much weight to what these models produce, giving too much credence to some of the things they say, and sometimes they can generate answers that are factually incorrect. They can generate dangerous answers. They can do all sorts of problematic things. And also, you have companies that go even further, and I think have a really unethical business model, which is to try to market AI companions. So I think of companies like Replica that will explicitly market this, use fine-tuned versions of language models like GPT-3 to sell access to these so-called quote-unquote virtual companions that are just, dressed up language models that they sell as, they market as AI companions that really care, that you can confide in, that you can treat as a friend, a mentor, a counselor, or even a romantic partner or a sexual partner. explicitly pushing that really anthropomorphic angle. So I think that's, it's already, you see people already, if you go online, people falling in love with these systems, or at least reporting that they do. And I think that's a disaster waiting to happen. So that's the danger of overclaiming. Underclaiming, on the other hand, a lot of people who I think might be erring on the side of underclaiming are actually motivated by ethical concerns, precisely because they want to resist overclaiming, they want to resist the hype. So I think it comes from a good place, as it were. It comes from a concern for the risks of overclaiming, but I think they are overcorrecting in the other direction in a lot of cases, and I think that comes with its own risks, including ethical concerns, which is a shame, because if you're concerned about AI ethics, you should really be concerned about calibrating your characterization of what current systems can and cannot do in the right way, so that you can inform the public as well as possible about potential risks. And if you err on the side of underclaiming and you say this is just for fancy autocomplete, it's really no smarter than the autocomplete feature on your phone when you write a text, or it's just a stochastic parrot that's just parroting sentences from the training data, well, you will kind of create a blind spot in people's mind if they buy into that picture wholesale, where they are not seeing the potential disruptive applications of these systems and the things they can already or will soon be able to do. And again, that's not to say that we're on the verge of anything like super intelligent AI, or that concerns about existential threats to humanity's existence are well placed necessarily. I'm rather skeptical about that, but it's more that there are everyday concerns, more mundane risks that are nonetheless very concerning, that are on the horizon, about whether it's about using language models for misinformation or manipulation of people, impersonation, in ways that are, that mere stochastic parrot or a language model that would be just a kind of fancy autocomplete feature like on your phone wouldn't be able to do. So I think on the horizon are sophisticated forms of misuse or risks of language models that are really tied to the kinds of cognitive capacities you can ascribe to them, or I would say proto-intelligent behavior you can ascribe to them, where these problematic behaviors precisely come from the fact that they are quite capable in some respects. They're not just these dumb stochastic parrots that some people say they are. So in a nutshell, that's, I think, the risks. And I think we ought to map out the middle ground, not just if we want to gain a better theoretical understanding of these models, which is a good and interesting goal in its own right, but also if we want to take the full measure of these minefield of ethical issues.
Great, thanks for that, Raphaël. There's a long list of things that AIs might have, like compositionality, intelligence, and so on. So I'm curious to ask about, one by one, go through these, ask about what they are. Do AIs have these? Are they important for AIs? But before we go through them one at a time, do you have a general map of how you see these different characteristics, or some other way to summarize them that might be useful?
Yeah, so generally I like to think about this as we have these systems, right, that are artificial systems, and we want to know what kind of capacities we can ascribe to them. And specifically, we want to know, in particular, when it comes to discussions about intelligence or comparisons to humans, the human mind, we want to know what kind of psychological or cognitive capacity we can ascribe to them. So we humans have a whole suite of cognitive capacities or psychological capacities. And we have different concepts to talk about them and carve them out, some of which are very broad concepts, very vague concepts like intelligence or consciousness, or just the very concept of a mind. It's a very kind of fuzzy concepts with blurry boundaries. And we apply these concepts also to non-human animals, to various species of animals that we deem more or less intelligent. We talked about animal minds or animal cognition. We talked about animal consciousness as well. And then we have some concepts that are a bit more specific. For example, we when it comes to human cognition, talk about certain specific faculties or capacities like memory, long-term memory, short-term memory. You can make further sub-distinctions. Capacity for thinking, capacity for reasoning, which might be slightly different. Capacities for language understanding language, but also understanding the world around us, visual understanding, perceiving the world. We have all of these different terms that we apply to carve out different aspects of human cognition and perception, and generally the human mind. And again, we apply these terms more or less liberally or conservatively to different non-human animal species, depending on where you stand. And we have a long tradition, a long history of trying to do that in a more principled, empirical way in the field of comparative psychology, comparing animal cognition and human cognition. So now we have these new systems that exhibit behavior that up until now was the kind of behavior that only humans could exhibit. First and foremost, speaking, producing language. So up until recently, fluently producing language in the way that systems like ChatGPT can do was a clear sign of a whole suite of cognitive capacities were ascribed to humans. Only humans could do that, and the capacity to generate this kind of fluent, seemingly intelligent language was something that was always associated with everything else that was associated with human minds. And so now we have this problem that we have these systems that can do that, but for the first time seem to call into question the association between the capacity for language production and all of these other capacities. So the way I like to think about the question you just asked is, let's take this on a case-by-case basis, have this kind of divide and conquer approach, where we take these different capacities, these different psychological properties that we can ascribe to humans, and maybe we can ascribe to non-human animals, and on a case-by-case basis decide, okay, based on the evidence and based on a specific definition of this capacity that has to be precise, specific enough that we can discuss it without falling into merely verbal dispute, that we don't talk past each other, can we reasonably ascribe that particular capacity to language models? And of course, oftentimes the answer is not going to be that clear-cut right now because it's still early days and this line of research is still emerging. But that's the kind of approach I like to take. So, and it's helpful then to go from the very general psychological properties like intelligence that are very vague and not necessarily very helpful, or understanding, another one. Understanding is, it can mean very many different things, and people mean very many different things by this term, and so they tend to talk past each other. So go from these to more specific sub distinctions of more specific kinds of capacities, where we have perhaps a better idea and a better empirical grip on to kind of arbitrate between different positions where people disagree on whether we can ascribe that capacity to language models.
So let's start with intelligence, which you've already mentioned. Maybe we could start with a definition of what intelligence means in the context of AI. And I know you've said that it's maybe hard to pin down exactly what that means, but your favorite definition is fine just to get this rolling.
Yeah, so that's a really hard question. I mean, for various reasons, also because intelligence, as we said, is a vague concept. It is also a somewhat problematic concept that is laden with all this historical baggage, including this really unfortunate baggage from the attempts to measure intelligence and psychometrics that is really historically intertwined with racist ideas about intelligence. So, for example, the whole history of the IQ measurement is intimately tied with extremely problematic ideas about what constitutes intelligence, and that were motivated initially by eugenist and racialist ideology. So it's problematic for these two reasons. So when we want to operationalize the notion of intelligence, we want to be able to measure it in a more objective way, and often that leads to things like the IQ measurement that kind of essentialize specific manifestations of intelligence in a way that really reduce the range of things we consider to be intelligence in a somewhat problematic way. And the same is true when we look at, say, human animal comparisons, and we kind of essentialize certain human manifestations of intelligence to deny intelligence to certain animal species where intelligence might be manifested in different ways and through different behaviors in species that don't have things like language, for example. So these are complicated questions. I do like this paper by François Chollet called On the Measure of Intelligence. That was a really interesting paper trying to bridge these kind of historical theoretical discussions about intelligence with discussions about how could we measure intelligence in AI systems. And he comes up with this pretty broad characterization of intelligence. It's been a really long time since I actually read the paper, but if I recall correctly, the definition goes something like this. So intelligence is characterized by two things. So the scope of applicability of kind of general problem solving skills. So systems will manifest their intelligence by being able to solve problems, and the range of problems that they're able to solve is one dimension of intelligence. So the scope of applicability of their intelligent problem solving skills. A system, for example, like Deep Blue, that was designed by IBM to play chess and beat Garry Kasparov, the world chess champion at the time. Chess playing system, that's a narrow system that has a very narrow scope of applicability, right? So people call it narrow AI because it's really designed to do just one thing and do it pretty well, but just do one thing, which is playing chess. And so it can only solve a very narrow range of problems. So that's one dimension. And according to Chollet, there is this other dimension, which is kind of the generalization power of a system. So how quickly and efficiently can it generalize to unseen situations, on unseen tasks, unseen problems, where or just generalize from one domain to another. So if it's learned to solve a problem in a specific domain and it's suddenly put in a completely new situation or new domain that it hasn't encountered before, how efficiently can it generalize to solving tasks in that domain? So say, for example, you train a robot, you build a robot that is designed to make coffee, and you train it, you have it learn how to make coffee in a specific kitchen where things are placed in certain ways. There's a specific layout of the kitchen, and there's a specific coffee maker, coffee grinder, the beans are in the place, and so on. It might become very good at that task, right? And make coffee super quick, excellent coffee every time, very consistent, much better than a human. But then suppose you take that robot and place it in a totally new kitchen where things are at different places, the layout is different, the beans are different, the apparatus is different. It might be that your robot is going to completely fail and not be able to perform even the basic first steps to make coffee just because it's not able to generalize to this new situation. So we humans are very good at generalizing, and children from a very young age are extremely good at generalizing to novel situations very quickly. So we're very efficient in this way, and that's one of the key characteristics of human intelligence. And to a large extent, non-human animals also are very good at that. Not as good as humans, because we have an extreme form of generalization where we are able to generalize to completely new domains that would range all the way to putting a man on the moon by building a rocket, things that no one has ever done before. So animals don't generalize that far, but it can generalize to novel situations, generally better than AI systems. So I like this kind of approach to intelligence because it's quite broad. It's not taking a really specific stance about the paper goes on about to discuss how we could measure intelligence, but that's a different question. But it's not reducing intelligence to a very narrow kind of range of problem-solving behavior, that the kind of thing that would be measured by the IQ test. And it's broad enough to be applicable to various kinds of systems, including humans, non-human animals, and artificial intelligence systems.
Listeners might be aware that recently GPT-4 was able to beat 90% of lawyers on a bar exam, for example. And there are many more examples of various LLMs performing quite well on written exams. What do test scores like a 90th percentile on the bar exam mean for AI compared to what they mean for a human? So I guess, and more generally, when an AI performs as well as a human on one of these narrow tasks, what does that mean for intelligence?
That's a really great question. There are a few things I would like to say here. So the first is just to tell your audience, there was this seeming leap between GPT-3 and GPT-4, like there was between GPT-2 and GPT-3. OpenAI released GPT-4 just a few weeks ago, and they showed that indeed this new model performs really well on various exams that were designed for humans, including the bar exam and various other exams, where GPT-3 was not doing that well. So GPT-3 perhaps was in the 30th percentile or something like that, and GPT-4 on a lot of these exams is in the 90th percentile, so performing as well or better than 90% of humans. So that's, at least seemingly on the face of it, very impressive. And it is impressive, and I don't want to take away from how impressive it is, but there are two main concerns about these results. So one first concern is about this problem called data contamination, which is that current systems like GPT-4 are trained on so much data because they are extremely data hungry and they need a lot of text to perform well. And the trend has been from the first transformer models in 2017, 2018 up to GPT-4 that we train bigger models. So we have bigger neural networks and we train them on more data. These two things have to scale together. So the bigger your model, the more data you need to train it on. And we realize we need a lot of data to get good models. And by a lot, it's really hard to wrap your head around it. It's more than 1 trillion words in the case of systems like GPT-4. So again, it's a significant subset of the whole internet. And then there is even speculation that we're running out of data by just scraping the open web for text, and that OpenAI had to use their in-house transcription algorithm called Whisper to transcribe things like perhaps podcasts or YouTube videos to get even more text, more words to train the models on. So it's certainly a humongous amount of data. And that data will basically encompass anything that humans talk about. And so it becomes harder and harder to rule out that the model has been trained on some of the things that you want to test it on. And that would include questions for an exam. Of course, there are many websites where people will discuss examples of questions from various exams. And that's a problem if you want to claim that your system has achieved excellent performance on an exam, because it could be that the system has just memorized the right answers to certain questions. And these systems are also very good at memorization. They are generally very lazy in the sense that if they can solve a problem by just brute forcing it and memorizing the answer, they will do it. So you find that there is a lot of memorization going on, and that's a feature and not a bug in a lot of cases, because it means that they know about a lot of world knowledge because they just memorized that, and they know about, say, the great works of literature because they memorized that. And so if you ask GPT-4 to recite the poem, The Tiger by John Keats, it will do it because it's memorized it. But you don't want, when you're testing the model's capacity, to have it just regurgitate answers it's memorized. And data contamination and leakage of the training data, the testing data into the training data is a very hard problem to mitigate because the corpus is so large that it's really hard to actually check that what you're testing the system on hasn't occurred anywhere in the training data, including in some variation. So maybe, maybe there's a question in the bar exam that's not quite the same as questions that have been asked in previous years. It's phrased in a different way, it's somewhat slightly different, but it's still similar enough that having encountered the slight variation in the question from a previous year is going to help you a lot to answer that question. So OpenAI took some precautions in a technical report to GPT-4. They talk about it, that they tried to control for that, but it's debatable how well they were able to control for that. And it's a really interesting question, actually, at which, where do you draw the line about when it becomes cheating for a model to have memorized some variations on a question? Because obviously, humans also cram when they pass exams, and they also learn from previous exam questions and things like that. But still, it's a concern. But the second and perhaps even more substantive concern is about how to interpret good performance on an exam that was designed for humans and not for LLMs, not for language models. And there we're hitting on this really big, important issue in the philosophy of AI and discourse on AI generally, which is this question of the gap between performance and competence. So one thing you can investigate when you look at the behavior of the model by testing it on exams, on benchmarks, and so on, and looking at the quality of the outputs, is the performance of the model. How well is it doing? How well does it score at the exam? How well does it score on the benchmark? That's all about the performance of the model. And so you can compare models, language models, and humans in terms of their performance, right? But by doing that, you don't just care about the performance, the exam score. What you really care about is the underlying competence that is supposed to be measured by the performance. So with humans, you know that the bar exam is supposed to measure human competence at certain, legal knowledge, for example. And you want to know that a lawyer is going to have that knowledge, and that you would hope that a lawyer that passes the bar, that is good evidence for an underlying competence at being a lawyer or an underlying competence in the law. But that's an assumption, and you need to kind of empirically validate that assumption by validating the construct validity of your exam or benchmark that was going to tell you, well, that's a well-formed, well-designed exam or benchmark that really gets at the underlying competence. And by the way, there could be concerns about that even with humans, because it could be that some exams. I mean, I'm a professor, teacher. I'm well aware of that with students. Sometimes you design a question for an exam and you realize it can be brute force in some ways, or there's a shortcut that students could learn to get good performance on that question that is not actually indicative of students having really learned the thing you wanted them to learn, having acquired the underlying competence. So that's not just a concern for models, but it's especially a concern when you want to translate, to take an exam that was designed for humans and just apply it to language models without further scrutiny or reflection about what this means. And so models getting good performance an exam doesn't necessarily mean that they have the same competence that would enable good performance in that exam for humans, because it might be that they solve that exam in a different way than humans do it. Again, with some memorization, with some shortcut learning, with some brute forcing of various heuristics and tricks that humans might not use themselves, because these two things, humans and language models, work very differently. So that's the two of the main concerns. I mean, they're connected to some extent. And it's not to take away from how impressive it is that GPT-4 can pass all these exams, but just to contextualize that. And I think much more research will need to be done to fully probe how to understand, how to interpret these results. And part of the problem here is that the training data for GPT-4 is not public. In fact, there is hardly any information publicly available about what the model is, even what is the architecture, what is the training data, how it was trained. And that makes it really hard to conduct rigorous research about this kind of question.
Now might be a good time, I think, to talk briefly about artificial general intelligence, which you've already mentioned a little bit. But first of all, how exactly do we define artificial general intelligence?
So I think this is one of these notions that is not always very helpful, because I think a lot of people assume that it refers to a specific determinate thing, when in fact I think people mean different things by the term, and generally I think the term might be a little unhelpful if it is coherent at all. So artificial general intelligence, the very broad way to characterize it is by contrast with artificial narrow intelligence. So again, think of the scope of applicability of a system. If a system is designed to only play chess and can only play chess and do nothing else, it's a very narrow system. And by contrast, humans and non-human animals, in fact, to a large extent, are able to solve a very broad range of problems. So the intelligence that humans have and that many non-human animals have to a lesser extent seems very general in comparison to, say, a chess-playing system. So by contrast with narrow systems, narrow AI, we talk about AGI, or artificial general intelligence, to refer to this goal of creating an artificial intelligence systems that would have a much broader range of applicability, scope of applicability, in terms of its problem-solving behavior than than current systems do. There are different concerns though with this notion. So one of them is that it's a very context-sensitive notion because the very notion of generality is context-sensitive. It's a vague predicate. And what I mean by that is that take, for example, the concept of the adjective tall. So you can talk about a tall building. But if I go to a small village in Italy and I refer to a tall building in that village, or I come, where I live here in New York City and talk about a tall building, I'm going to refer to very different things. What's a tall building in a small village is very different from what's a tall building in New York. And the reason is just context sensitive, right? It depends on the height of the surrounding buildings. And it might not really make sense to talk about a tall building in absolute terms without having that kind of context, again, because it depends what your reference point is. And similarly, for the concept of AGI, what seems like a general system in some contexts in comparison with other systems might not be so general in comparisons with others. So certainly the problem-solving skills or the intelligence of a rat seems extremely general compared to that of something like a chess-playing algorithm. But compared to humans, it doesn't seem general at all. And so that's one of the concerns people have, is that it's not really clear that there's a line in the sand that would be the point at which we reach AGI, where all of a sudden we go from a narrow system to a general system. It's more of this spectrum, this gradient of generality, where systems can have a more narrow or broader scope of applicability of their problem-solving behavior and general intelligent behavior. So, for example, companies like OpenAI talk about AGI more like sometimes more like a goal where there is a clear line in the sand. So, for example, in a recent statement, they talk about when we reach the first AGI system, the first AGI. And it's somewhat unclear to me what the first AGI would be. It probably would be a matter of interpretation. Some people say that GPT-4, they think of it like a form of AGI, and it's a bit meaningless because it's like, well, yes, it seems arguably more general in its scope of applicability than GPT-3 is. It's also much less general to really understate it. I mean, it's really, really much less general than humans in terms of its scope of applicability. So that's one concern. No bright light in the sand. There is a broader concern that people say, well, there's no such thing as general intelligence simpliciter. It's just an incoherent notion. And what people have in mind when they say these things would be a few different things. So one, there is the theorem in computer science, the North-Free-Lunch theorem, that says that any algorithm that can learn effectively must be somewhat specialized. It must have some inductive biases to learn certain solutions to certain problems. You can't have a maximally general, universal intelligence in that sense. It's linked to this mathematical theorem, and there's a sense in which the idea of a maximally general or universal intelligence is somewhat incoherent from that perspective. And then there is a more specific concern, which is that even if you leave that aside, and if you take human intelligence, well, even human intelligence is not that general in some sense. It's been molded by evolution to fit a certain niche and to apply to a certain specific set of problems that humans are concerned with. And so in that sense, it's not that general. It's been kind of finely tuned to the range of problems that humans encounter. And other algorithms, non-human animals, have intelligence that has been tuned for their ecological niche and is different. And perhaps there is a sense in which it might be a little misleading to say, to set up the comparison between humans and some non-human animals just by saying humans have a more general intelligence. It might be, if you talk to some biologists, it might be, well, perhaps it's more informative to say that humans have intelligence that's more tailored to their niche and they've evolved in a certain way, and that led them to be able to do all sorts of things that is unhelpful and for other organisms in other niches to evolve towards. So that's another concern, that this setting up this whole discussion in terms of this single dimension of generality of intelligence is overly reductionist, and that it leads to it's almost kind of reproducing this old idea from medieval philosophy of the scala and ashura, this kind of scale of nature where you have humans at the top and like worms at the bottom or something, and maybe God above humans, and it's all on this single continuum, which where you have superior beings and inferior beings, and that's very problematic for various reasons.
It sounds like with these claims of GPT-4 maybe having early signs of artificial general intelligence. I'm not sure if you've seen this paper, Sparks of Artificial General Intelligence, Early Experiments with GPT-4. Sounds like you're quite bearish on this, though. Could you maybe explain a little bit more why you don't think this is sparks of AGI? And I know you've already talked about why the definition of AGI is quite vague and open to interpretation. But what makes you, I guess, what do you think makes you more bearish on this than, say, the authors of this paper?
Right. So I would say that it's not so much that I'm bearish on the outlook of this paper as much as I think it's not the most helpful way to set up the discussion about the capacities of language models, having this kind of dichotomy, again, very polarized dichotomy between these either stochastic parrots or sparks of AGI. And instead, again, I would advocate for this divide and conquer approach, where we take things on a case-by-case basis. We take different capacities and we say, where do language models fall with respect to the capacity? Do they have anything like the human-like version of that capacity? Do they have something different? Can we get more specific by looking at the computations that these models learn to implement during training and try to reverse engineer what's going on inside? So the Sparks of AGI paper, one of my qualms with that paper, as I think many other people's qualms about it, is that it diverges quite a bit from the normal standards of, say, rigorous scientific research about language models. It's a paper that's a very long paper, in fact, that's almost 150 pages, that was written by researchers at Microsoft that got access to GPT-4 6 months, I think, before the release, the unveiling of the model, and got to test it on a bunch of different tasks. And so the paper is, first of all, it's a preprint, so it's not peer-reviewed, and it's this kind of collection of somewhat anecdotal tests where they just tested the model on some things they thought were interesting and reported the performance of the model. But there is little in the paper that is really systematic, even in terms of behavioral testing. So testing on rigorous, well-designed benchmarks. So it's more giving examples of successes and failures, but mostly successes of the model. And so I think many people are concerned that it was pandering to the hype a little bit, because it's hard to resist the impression reading the paper that it's saying, look how cool, like GPT-4 can do that, it can do that, it can do this. And as a researcher, you read that and it's a bit like, okay, yes, it's intriguing, it's interesting. Now, is this consistent? Can the model, if I change the prompt, can it do just as well? Is it systematic? What does it actually mean in terms of the underlying capacities of the model? Can we test that more systematically? And can we go beyond behavior by opening up the model, looking inside, trying to figure out how the model is doing all of these behaviors? That, I think, is the most interesting line of research, not just looking at behavior, and especially not just cherry picking some anecdotal results and saying, look how cool. And the problem here is that, again, GPT-4 is not a very open system. There is an API that now people can use to test the model, but one of the big problems is that you can't go beyond the API. So you don't have access to the weights of the model, so you can't actually probe the model and use various techniques to go beyond behavior. But also, even just looking at behavior, even if you just want to systematically evaluate the performance of the model on a benchmark, for example, or on a specific set of prompts, OpenAI keeps updating it on the back end. And so what you see a lot nowadays is that someone will point out a failure mode of the model on Twitter, say, And then a week later, you try the very same prompt and the model will succeed and give you the right output. And people have speculated with good reason that probably OpenAI is patching the model, playing kind of failure mode whack-a-mole on the back end, and silently patching the model as they go. So even with the Sparks of AGI paper, it's kind of tricky because some people have tried some of the prompts they used and it didn't work with the model that we have access to through the API. They say it wasn't the same model, so it's very opaque basically, and there is, it kind of straddles the line for me and for many other people where it's not really, it's kind of hard to see that as scientific research at this point. It's more like almost like a product advertisement for something that's no longer a research artifact, but more of a product being marketed. So that's my broader concern. But in terms of the being bearish, I mean, no, I do think that there are highly non-trivial capacities that these systems, especially GPT-4, have, clearly, that it's not just a stochastic parrot. And so I just fall somewhere in between. But again, I think we need rigorous research. We need to progress with this kind of empiricist mindset where we rigorously test things, we keep an open mind, and we do things on a case-by-case basis.
I want to talk a little bit about consciousness and maybe sentience as well now. So I guess I could ask about the definition of consciousness, and are large language models conscious now? Can they be? And of course, those are two very different questions. But it's also interesting to me that with large language models, we seem to focus more on consciousness than sentience. And I'm just curious about if you have any thoughts about why that is, but maybe we can just start with a definition of consciousness. And do you think large language models are conscious, and can they be?
So consciousness is another one of these big words that are a little vague. Often people don't necessarily have a very specific definition in mind, or rely more on an intuitive grasp of the concept, or might disagree and fall prey to verbal disputes or talking past each other because they don't intend the same thing by the term. Generally, in philosophy, when people talk about consciousness, they refer to subjective experience. Now, you might say, what is subjective experience? And here is the problem, which is that famously, it's hard to give a non-circular definition of consciousness. So best thing you can do is try to kind of appeal to what point to certain things that you hope that everyone has an intuitive familiarity with from just being a human being that experiences the world. So you can say, well, consciousness is that thing that is present, when you wake up in the morning, but is lost in dreamless deep sleep or in the coma. It's that thing that's manifested whenever you have any kind of experience, whether it's tasting an apple or looking at a sunset, and it's a subjective feel of all of these different experiences. What it is like. That's what the term that philosophers generally use. What it's like to undergo a certain experience. And presumably there is nothing it's like to be a rock, because rocks don't have subjective experiences, and so that's why we say rocks are not conscious. And there is something it's like to be a human, at least when we're awake, when we're not in a deep dreamless sleep or in a coma. And presumably also there is something it's like to be many non-human animal species, although it might be hard to exactly know what it's like from the inside, as it were. There's a famous paper from Thomas Nagel called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" that makes this point, right? It's kind of hard to know what it's like to be a bat because our sensory apparatus is very different from bats. So sometimes people draw this distinction between consciousness and sentience, but a lot of people in philosophy use these two terms interchangeably. And in fact, I myself, in my own work, have used these two terms interchangeably. But when people draw a distinction, generally they think that consciousness is perhaps a slightly higher bar and slightly more sophisticated capacity. So sentience would just be the capacity to experience valent states such as pleasure and pain. So the capacity to have certain experiences that are subjectively valuable or disvaluable, that feel good or bad, for example. And perhaps consciousness, if you draw that kind of distinction, might be something a little more sophisticated that might involve perhaps having a sense of self or having the capacity to be aware of your own experiences as you undergo them, perhaps reflect upon them, have some kind of metacognition, something like that. So there are various views there, but generally when people want to distinguish consciousness and sentience, that's roughly how they think of the distinction. And so you might say, well, maybe some very basic, simple non-human animal species, like certain species of worms or mollusks, cephalopods, might have sentience in the sense that they can experience pleasure or pain. If you harm them, they might experience, but maybe they don't have consciousness in the full-blown sense in which we humans have conscious experiences that have it's kind of a rich tapestry of experiences that includes sense of self and again, a meta-awareness of our experiences and all of these things. But I personally generally prefer to just talk about consciousness, broadly speaking, as a single thing without distinction of sentience and consciousness, to avoid verbal disputes, avoid this problem that people mean different things, and just stick to this very, very broad definition. Consciousness is just having subjective experience, having something it's like to be something. And so in that sense, if the worm is capable of feeling pain, that counts in my book as being conscious. And then you can have a further discussion about whether there might be degrees of consciousness. You can be more or less conscious, but at least there's the lights are on in some sense. There's something it's like to be that animal. Okay, so now language models, are they conscious? Is there anything it's like to be GPT-4? That's a bit of a fraught discussion. It's really come into the limelight recently because, especially when this engineer from Google, Blake Lemoine, started claiming that the in-house chatbot called Lambda was sentient and really kind of tried to blow the whistle about this, ended up being fired from Google subsequently. And there were a lot of very sensationalistic press media articles about this. It made the buzz. I think it's a little bit unfortunate how this whole discussion has been set up because Blake Lemoine made a lot of baseless claims based on his interactions with the model. It's worth mentioning that he was not himself involved in the design of Lambda. He was not, an expert in the design of the systems. He just had internal access at Google and so started playing with it. And he ended up forming the belief that Lambda was sentient, as he confessed himself or just acknowledged, based on his deep religious beliefs. So he's a profoundly religious man, and his conclusion that Lambda was sentient wasn't really based on the scientific method, but more premised on certain religious beliefs. And if you look at his interactions with Lambda, he asked a lot of leading questions. And the thing about language models is that they are very good at mimicking all sorts of linguistic behavior. I have this piece that I wrote for Nautilus last summer where I say, instead of calling them stochastic parrots, you might call them stochastic chameleons, and maybe that's a more accurate term, which is they can kind of blend in different sorts of linguistic concepts and mimic different kinds of agents, including engaging in creative fiction. They're very good at that, and that's one of the best uses for language models we have today. And if you prime them by asking them, what do you feel, or do you have any experiences, and what it's like to be you? What is it like to be you? Well, of course, they're gonna engage in that mode because they've been trained on a bunch of literature. They've been trained on so many books and web pages and text that describes subjective experiences, and so they're perfectly good at engaging in that kind of mimicry and describing experiences that humans have and humans have described in the training data. That obviously doesn't entail that they themselves experience these experiences, that they have subjective experiences and feelings. So you shouldn't take what they say at face value. That goes for checking the factual accuracy of statements they make about the world. Like when you ask them about factual statements and they give you an answer, you should always fact check that. And that goes for, especially when you ask them about their own experience, because this is a leading question that will just lead them to confabulate various claims about what they feel. So that's really a very, very poor source of evidence about whether language models have conscious experiences or not. But the problem is that until now, verbal reports was one of the best sources of evidence about whether someone experiences something and what do they experience. That's what we do in a lot of experiments in psychology. We ask participants what they felt with questionnaires and interviews and so on. So it works for humans, it doesn't work for language models. There is a double dissociation between linguistic behavior and consciousness, where on the one hand, with animals, non-human animals, we see that they can't speak, they can't just tell us what they feel, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't feel anything. And in fact, the trend has been that we've realized, based on the behavior and decades of studies in animal cognition, that a lot of animals probably have a rich tapestry of experience, and that has all sorts of ethical implications for factory farming and how we treat these animals if they can feel pain. So we shouldn't discount them just because they can speak. They probably can experience a lot. And conversely, language models can speak in some sense. They can generate language, but that doesn't mean that they experience anything. So there's double dissociation that's really selling these days. So do they experience something? What other source of evidence could we look at? And that's where things get really tricky, because we don't have a fully worked out scientific theory of consciousness at this point. And I think we're still very far from that. So we really don't have a good principled scientific way to arbitrate this question of whether language models have conscious experiences. The best we can do is look at the current leading theories of consciousness and see whether language models have any of the requirements according to these various theories for consciousness. And if you look at that, well, it's extremely, extremely unlikely that current language models have conscious experiences, because the architecture is extremely simple compared to the architecture of the human brain or animal brains. And in particular, some of the features of animal brains or human brains that seem to be quite important with this and correlated to experiences, especially in the human case. We can look at the structures that seem to support consciousness in the lab. There's a long now history of neuroscientists trying to investigate the neural correlates of consciousness in the lab. You can see that things like recurrent processing, having the capacity to process information through recurrent feedback loops, seems to be quite important, for example. And current language models are purely feed-forward networks and don't have any recurrent loops. That's one example. That don't seem to have any kind of capacity for metacognition in the way that humans can, and the list goes on. So for various reasons, and if your audience is interested in this, I recommend there is a good talk by David Chalmers, my colleague from NYU, that's on YouTube on that question, where he goes through that kind of consideration. But based on this evidence, I would say it's extremely unlikely that current systems are conscious. Could they one day become conscious? Presumably, yes. I mean, I don't see any reason to doubt that, unless you have a very strong view that says that capacity for consciousness is intrinsically tied to the biological makeup of animal and human brains. There's something specific about carbon-based life form that you can't replicate on a silicon chip, that you couldn't realize in a different kind of hardware. But if you don't hold that view, then yes, presumably someday we could get there, but I don't think we're there yet.
Great, thanks. And we'll throw up a link to David Chalmers' talk in the show notes, and also any other paper that we've referred to as well will be there. Moving on to theory of mind. So this is the capacity to understand other people by ascribing mental states to them. Children typically don't get this until around 4 to 5 years old, arguably. And a classic example of this is you might ask a child what they're doing during a phone call, and they'll say they're playing with this. They assume that you know what this is, even though you can't see it. So they don't have a theory of mind. Do large language models have theory of mind? Is this important? How would we measure this?
Yeah, so that's a very hotly debated question these days. Because GPT-4 came out, and even before that, GPT 3.5 was already displaying this wide array of impressive behavior. And so some people were keen to check whether you could describe anything like a theory of mind to the systems. So the capacity to kind of model the psychological states of other agents and keep track of them and draw inferences about them. And this is quite important because, many people think that something like a theory of mind is a vital part of the way in which we understand language in conversation, because the meaning of sentences that are uttered in a conversation, beyond the face value meaning of the sentence, there are a lot of pragmatic aspects to language that stem from inferences about what the other speaker means. So, for example, if you ask me if I'm coming to the party on Friday and I tell you, no, I have some student essays to grade. Sorry, I don't say no. I say, I have some student essays to grade. I haven't told you yes or no whether I'm going to come to the party. And in fact, my answer doesn't strictly entail that I'm not coming. I could have some student essays to grade, but still decide to come anyway. But there is an implicature there, what linguists call an implicature, which is that I'm not coming. That's an example where you kind of have to infer from what I'm saying about what I intend to convey, to communicate in the conversation. And there are more sophisticated pragmatic phenomena that influence understanding of meaning that seem to be tied with in theory of mind and inferences about the psychological states of the person you're speaking to, what they want, what they believe in conversation. So if you're interested in language understanding in language models, that seems to be also like a piece of the puzzle that's interesting to investigate. And generally, it's an important part of research on intelligent behavior in humans and non-human animals. So people have tried to take tests that have been used to assess capacities for theory of mind, say in children, and apply these tests to language models. So that would be things like little stories where you tell the person, the child, of a language model about a little scenario where there are two different agents, and one has access to certain information that the other agent doesn't have access to, and you ask a question that where it seems like giving a right answer would hinge on accurately tracking the mental states of the two agents, and knowing that one has certain beliefs and the other one doesn't. So kind of tracking what these agents know in the story. So this paper that came out a few weeks back, I think from Kosinski from Stanford, that was trying to, was claiming that a theory of mind has emerged in language models like GPT 3.5 and GPT-4. And it was using this standardized, standard kind of task to probe that again in humans. The problem is that's a great example of this kind of performance competence distinction we discussed earlier. The question is, the finding was that the language models were doing really well. And so the researcher concluded, well, they must have induced, formed the theory of mind during training, that it has emerged. It's an emergent capacity of these models. But actually, another researcher, Thomas Ullman, wrote this preprint in a direct answer to that particular work, where he took the same stimuli, the same tasked prompts that were used to probe the capacities of language models versus the theory of mind, and he just made some tweaks to add some distractors or some differences that for humans wouldn't make a big difference about how we parse the prompt and the kind of answer we give, but was able to totally throw off the language models, where their performance totally broke down when you just introduce these tweaks in the prompts. And that's pretty good evidence that it was a case of gap between performance and competence, where on the initial tasks, the humans and language models were doing just as well in terms of performance, but the underlying competence was there for the humans, but not there for the language models. And just controlling for the experiment by introducing some variations in the prompts and some tweaks reveals that gap. So the bottom line is, I think currently the evidence suggests that no, a theory of mind hasn't emerged in language models. They probably don't have, they're probably missing some components to the architecture to get there. So something missing probably from the systems to get there. But we'll see. Time will tell. But it's a good lesson in trying to, how can we set up good, rigorous experiments to test language models on certain tasks that humans have been tested on.
You were on a panel recently talking about the challenge of compositionality for AI. So what is compositionality in AI?
So compositionality is a notion that comes from linguistics. And there's this idea that the meaning of a whole, of a complex expression like a sentence, is determined by the meaning of its constituent parts, like the individual words in the sentence, together with the way in which they are syntactically combined. So the grammatical structure of the sentence, for example. So indeed, when you're listening to me speak, for example, I'm uttering sentences, and the way in which you're understanding the sentences I'm uttering involves knowing the meaning of the individual words that I'm using, but also how to put them together into coherent wholes based on the grammatical structure of the sentences. And the structure matters, of course, because if you say John loves Mary, that doesn't mean the same thing as Mary loves John, even though you're using the very same words. So when it comes to AI, essentially there has been a long history of people thinking that the kinds of systems that current language models are based on, namely artificial neural networks or cognitionist systems, are pretty bad at parsing complex expressions compositionally, or generally at combining simple representations into complex representations with this kind of compositional structure. So there's this idea that compositionality is a challenge for language models, and more generally for AI systems that are based on these artificial neural networks. It's not just a problem for discussions of language processing. It's more broadly a problem for trying to build artificial intelligence generally, because people have extended this notion of compositionality not just to apply to language in the way we humans understand language and produce language by combining complex, simple expressions, but also apply that notion to thinking, to thought as well, right? So it seems like thought as well has this compositional property where to think complex thoughts and to understand complex thoughts, we're putting together simpler representations, simpler concepts, and combining them in certain ways that have a certain compositional structure, a bit like the grammar of sentences. And again, this idea that we humans do that very well. We can do that in systematic ways, such that if I have the concepts John, marry, and love, loving, I can think John loves Mary, but I can also think Mary loves John. And artificial neural networks, because of the way they work and the way in which the format in which their representations are couched, which is with continuous vector representations, it was traditionally thought they don't really have the resources to do that kind of thing, to combine representations together with this kind of systematic structure, because to combine representations, they can blend vectors together, but that doesn't seem to have the right kind of structure. And in my own work, I have this project where I've been suggesting that this is too simplistic, and that actually current language models and current deep learning architectures generally seem to actually be able to have form representations that have a rich compositional structure, and that goes a long way towards explaining why they can generate grammatical well-formed sentences. For example, in the case of language models, if you talk to a language model, as everyone who has talked to ChatGPT knows, it's rarely generating a non-grammatical sentence. So it's very good at putting words together into coherent, grammatically well-formed expressions, including totally novel sentences that it's never encountered before, that it's just making up. So it's not just brute force memorization. So the compositional performance seems to be there. There's also a lot of empirical evidence about compositional generalization of these models and various other pieces of evidence. But there is also work that goes beyond behavior, that opens up these systems and tries to reverse engineer what's going on inside. And that's the kind of evidence I'm building on in this work, that suggests to me that they're actually able to form these mechanisms to combine representations together compositionally, but in a way that is different from the way in which classical symbolic systems, these old school systems that we used to use before the advent of neural networks, achieve that. So old school systems, to form a complex representation, they would just concatenate simple representations into the complex representations. So say if you want to have a system that processes or forms a complex representation, John loves Mary, that will literally involve taking the representation for John, the representation for Mary, and the representation for love, and concatenate them together with a certain structure in the complex representation John loves Mary. And by contrast, connectionist systems like neural networks, they perform they perform transformations of vectors. So they take vectors and they modify them in certain ways. But what I don't want to get too much to the details because that would involve a lot of linear algebra and some pretty technical empirical evidence. But I think the way in which they do these manipulations of vectors and these transformations in the transformer architecture actually affords them with the capacity to have the right kind of structure to generate sophisticated compositional behavior, but in a way that doesn't reduce to this classical symbolic old school kind of architectures. So it's not just merely implementing a classical symbolic architecture, it's doing something different. And I think that's a really interesting finding because maybe it might open up new avenues of research to think about how we humans actually are able to achieve the compositional behavior that we exhibit when we produce novel sentences or understand sentences.
Yeah, and sort of related to that, I guess, is language understanding in large language models. Do large language models understand language in any meaningful sense?
Yeah, that's also a very big question. And yet another one of these words, understanding, which is fraught with verbal disputes and generally vagueness. So the way I like to put this, I'll try not to be too long on this, but is try to put this notion of understanding to the side because it's confounded by associations. People, for example, some people think of understanding as requiring consciousness. Like to understand language, you need to have an experience, a feeling of understanding. And I want to put that aside because I think even if you think that language models don't have any capacity for consciousness, you might still meaningfully ask about whether they're able to, in a more narrow sense, understand, parse the meaning of sentences in some sense. So I like to talk about semantic competence instead of understanding to try to rule out these associations. And then you can further break this down. So you can talk about lexical semantic competence, which is about understanding word meanings or, having the right kind of capacity to having the right kind of knowledge about word meaning, the meaning of words, or compositional semantic competence or structural semantic competence, which is about understanding complex expressions like sentences or paragraphs. And you can also make another distinction between what you might call referential semantic competence, which is the capacity to connect words to what they refer to out there in the world. For example, if I'm in the street and I see a pigeon or a dog, I can point to it and recognize it and use the word dog or pigeon in connection to that thing I see. So I can connect that word to what I'm seeing out there in the world. Or if we're at dinner and you ask me, can you pass me the salt? I'll be able to pick up the shaker, the salt shaker, and give it to you. So I connect that word salt to things out there in the world. And there is this other notion of inferential semantic competence that pertains to not connecting words or linguistic items to whatever they refer to out there in the world, but connecting words to each other. That's what we do when we, for example, define words. We use more words to explicitate the meaning of a word. So it's a word-to-word relation. So definitions is one example. Or synonyms, if you ask me to give you a synonym for a word, I give you another word. That's a word-to-word relation. Paraphrasing, summarizing, all of these things kind of involve having this network of relationship between words. So language models, I would argue, and I have some work in which I do argue that have a really highly non-trivial degree of inferential competence, at least when it comes to word meanings. So because they're trained to, they learn from the statistical distribution of words in a very large corpus, they learn all sorts of relationship between words that are exactly the kind of relationship that are useful to then use in definitions, paraphrase, summarization, synonymy, and so on. And so that enables these systems to exhibit a highly non-trivial degree, in my opinion, of inferential semantic competence, to have these very fine-grained networks of relationship between words that map onto relationship between vectors that represent the words in the vector space that these systems use to generate words. When it comes to referential competence, it's a much more controversial question because the systems don't have access to the external world, and therefore the degree to which you could say that they're able to connect the linguistic items they work with to whatever these items refer to in the external world is very debatable and very controversial. I actually did argue in a recent preprint that I wrote with my colleague Dimitri Kolomolo that they might qualify as having some form of referential competence. That hinges on a somewhat complex argument. But the idea is that some systems like ChatGPT, they're not just trained from next word prediction. They also, after they're pre-trained on next word prediction, they are fine-tuned with human feedback. So they undergo this like further little bit of training where you ask the model to generate text based on prompts, like you ask them questions, for example, questions about various things, and you ask humans to provide feedback about of different outputs, which one was the best, which one was the most informative, helpful, harmless, truthful. So that includes a normative component, which is truthfulness or honesty, how accurate the outputs of the model were. And you then fine-tune the model on that. So it's not just next word prediction, you're kind of infusing the model with a function that's not just a linguistic function like next word prediction, but that's actually world-involving because you provide feedback to the model on the accuracy of its output that's dependent on the actual state of the world. If you ask the model what's the capital of France and it tells you Berlin, that's a wrong answer, and you give it feedback about the inaccuracy. So we argue, based on this somewhat technical argument, that this might be a way in which the model can actually have a learning process that has the right kind of descriptive normativity to have, to achieve some form of referential competence. Because you're providing feedback about the reference indirectly, the reference of the worlds of the words in the world, and accuracy condition for that kind of reference. It's not the kind of direct competence we have because we interact directly with the world and we perceive the world and walk around in the world and we do all these things. It's much more mediated and indirect, but nonetheless, we think it's there in a limited degree. So that's a long-winded answer, and so that's I've talked mostly about lexical competence, so what pertains to word meaning, but that would translate also to structural competence because the systems can very well actually put together words into sentences that are well formed, coherent, and so on. And so yes, I would argue that also translate to some form of structural or compositional semantic competence. So the bottom line is, do they have human-like language understanding? No. Clearly, I mean, there are various failure modes. They don't understand language as humans do. They're still limited with all the pragmatic dimension of language, certainly with the theory of mind thing we've discussed before. And they just don't learn language in the way humans do. Children don't learn language by reading thousands of books to learn the meaning of the word dog. People point at the dog and say, that's a dog. And, they have this kind of very perceptually grounded approach to language learning. So that they work very differently. They don't learn language the same way, and they have a much more limited understanding of language. But nonetheless, if you think that it's a matter of degree and not just an either-or dichotomy, I would argue they have some limited but non-trivial degree of semantic competence.
In terms of reference, now that we're attaching things like vision to large language models, is this all moot? Is that going to be enough to give that reference? For example, with GPT-4 having vision attached in some way, how does that change this discussion, if at all?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting and somewhat complicated question because sometimes people assume that just hooking up this language models to images in addition to text is just going to be enough to bridge that gap in terms of referential competence. And actually, what we argue in that paper I mentioned that I wrote with my colleague Dimitri Kolomolo is that there is a double dissociation between having access to images and being able to achieve referential grounding or kind of referential competence. The reason for that is that the system like DALL-E 2, it learns by being trained on pairs of captions and images. So it learns by being trained on images and together with a caption. But it's not actually getting any feedback about what words refer to out there in the world. You can think of the images that the model is fed to as just more tokens that being made of more tokens that the model is trained on. So if you think that the words of the English language are, and the words that sentences are made of, are tokens for the model to process, and images also are broken down into patches that correspond to tokens, like a vocabulary for images, like a kind of like visual words, as it were. For the model, is just tokens all the way down. So the model is learning to associate certain visual tokens with word tokens, but it's still arguably it stays at the level of this kind of inferential competence of relating tokens to other tokens without exiting this kind of merry-go-round of intra-token relationships in order to ground representations to the external world. And by contrast, ChatGPT, when it's fine-tuned with this explicit human feedback, even though it doesn't have access to images, we argue it might be achieving some limited form of referential competence just by virtue of getting this direct human feedback. So somewhat counterintuitively, you might think that, well, adding images to these systems is what gives them referential grounding, and solve the grounding problem. And we say, actually, no, that these are two different things. I mean, you can put them together, and that's ideal. So what you would want to do, ideally, is having systems that would learn the meaning of words by interacting with the world, where they would get some feedback from the world about what words mean. That wouldn't be just passively learning to match caption and images, for example, which is very different from how humans would learn the meaning of words. So that would get you closer to something like the human-like referential competence for the use of various words.
So we've talked about a number of different characteristics that large language models might have, and there are many more that we didn't get a chance to talk about. But to try and tie this discussion together, which of these faculties are most useful to understand? Now, of course, that depends on what we're interested in. But for example, if we wanted to know whether artificial general intelligence was here or if it's close, which of these faculties might we look at? Which are most useful, and maybe for some other situations, which of these are most useful to understand?
So there are a number of ways in which current models are still very limited. One of them is that they undergo this training phase, so they get trained on a lot of data. And by the way, they require an enormous amount of data to learn to perform well, much more than children actually need. So they are significantly less efficient at learning. And here there might be some connection between learning efficiency and intelligence. Think again of the François Chollet point about power, generalization power being related to intelligence. So that in and out of itself is a limitation. So they learn from this tremendous amount of data. And then once they're trained, they are frozen, as people say. So they no longer learn. The weights of the model don't change. And you can just run inference on the system by prompting it and generating outputs, which is not associated with any updating of the model. So there's no more learning. There is no more evolution of the system. It's totally frozen in that sense. And that's extremely different from the way in which biological systems live, evolve, and learn and acquire intelligent capacities. Humans and non-human animals are capable of lifelong learning, as people say. So that just means that we constantly learning and adapting our knowledge and representations of the world based on our experiences and based on incoming stimuli, based on what we do and say and think and so on. And these language models don't. So that's one major limitation, in my opinion. Having systems that can learn on an ongoing basis would be interesting. Another major limitation that these systems don't really have anything like the kinds of memory capacities that humans have, in the sense that they don't really have a long-term memory in the same way that we do. We can store things, experiences in long-term memory. That's somewhat related to the point about lifelong learning, in the sense that when you talk to a chatbot, say, at the end of the conversation, it's going to forget everything about what you've talked about. There's no long-term storage. There is a kind of brute force approximation of a long-term memory, just because during the training phase, the model can just memorize whole sequences of text. But beyond that, there is no equivalent to how long-term memory works in human and non-human animals. It's also debatable to what extent there is anything like a short-term memory in the way that it works in humans and non-human animals, where these models can memorize the content of the prompt once in the context window that you use to prompt them, and back and forth in the conversation for a few thousand words. but that's not quite the same as the way in which working memory works in humans and arguably not human animals. So that's another limitation, in my opinion. And of course, you want also systems that don't just learn from text, but learn from other modalities. And we're getting closer to that. We have nowadays a lot of systems that also learn from images. We are slowly getting systems that might start being able to learn from videos, but that's a much harder, much more challenging problem because then you introduce dimension of time, and that's still a very tough nut to crack. So I think there will be progress in the right direction when we can get models that can actually learn from videos consistently. But ultimately, you want to go even beyond that, because all of these things I mentioned would still be a form of passive learning. We just feed a bunch of data out of the system, and it just passively learns from that data by doing something like next time step prediction or next token prediction. Ultimately, if you want more human-like systems that exhibit more human-like intelligence, you would want them to actually learn like humans do by interacting with the world. And so interactive learning, not just passive learning. You want something that's more active, where the model is going to actually test out some hypothesis and learn from the feedback it's getting from the world about these hypotheses in the way children do. Children all the time, if you observe young, babies and toddlers, they are constantly experimenting. They're like little scientists. You see babies grabbing their feet and kind of testing whether that's part of my body or not, and kind of learning gradually and very quickly learning all these things. Language models don't do that. They don't explore in this way. They don't have the capacity for interaction in this way. They learn purely passively, and that's a major difference with biological intelligence as well. So these are just a few examples. There are others. I think we probably need them to develop something like a metacognition, the ability to think about their own outputs and reflect upon their own thought processes, something like introspection as well, being able to have some kind of internal representation of their own representations and reflect upon that. And maybe that could emerge from the bottom up spontaneously as a kind of emergent capability, or maybe you will need to build into the system. That is an open question. Generally, the debate on these questions in AI is that some people think you can get all of these things for free, or like at least you don't need to make major modifications to current architectures to get a lot of these, the remaining capacities that are missing from the systems, to get them to emerge just by scaling up current architectures and training them on more data and training bigger models. I'm not so sure. I think we'll need to make some important modifications, and I don't know what the next breakthrough is going to be.
Well, thank you for that. This has been really good, really great overview of some of the faculties as they relate to large language models. There's many more topics that we could talk about, and I would have liked to have gotten to, but unfortunately didn't have time. But I think this has been a really good overview, and hopefully our listeners find this useful. If anyone wants to find out more about you and your work, where could they go? And I know that you are quite active on Twitter, and some of your Twitter threads are very informative and useful for my own research for this interview. But where would you like to point people to go to if they'd like to see more about you and your work?
Yes, so I have a Twitter account. So I'm at Raphaël Millière, so Raphael, my first name, and my last name Milliere, Raphaël Millière on Twitter. I also have a website, which is just raphaelmilliere.com. I need to update it. It's been a while since I updated it, but usually I would put there not just my academic work, but also my public engagement work. I'm quite passionate about public engagement. I do some public writing, and I actually have a piece that I co-authored with my colleague Charles Radkoff that should come out soon in The Atlantic. That's precisely about this issue of the extreme polarization of the discussion on AI and how we can carve out that middle ground. So if people are interested in that, you can probably find it soon. I'll share it on Twitter. And yeah, that's about it.
Sounds great. Well, thank you so much again for joining us. Really appreciate your time, and all the best.
Thank you for having me. This was really enjoyable.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode. You can subscribe to the Sentience Institute podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or any podcast app.